Hello, internet friends, and welcome to Keep the Game Moving. This time I'm excited to be talking with another fellow Cthulhu GM, among many other things. You know, nobody runs just one system. Dave Sokolowski. Dave, thank you so much for joining us.
Ezra, I'm so thankful to be here. Thanks for including me.
Dave has, let me see if I can say, yeah, Dave has I'm not going to say honor. I don't know he is the last person that I played D&D with.
Okay.
We played a pandemic game of D&D, and it was
last year. That was a 2020 pandemic.
Yeah,
I was thinking about that. It was a long time ago. It feels like a long time. Last summer sometime. Yeah.
I don't play a lot of D&D. Let's just
okay.
And I really, it was a lot of fun. So, Dave, what was your intro to GMing? How did you get started being a GM?
Oh, we're just gonna go straight to the back of the closet and get all the stuff marked 1980.
That's right. Yeah.
I had a conversation with my mom a couple months ago, and I was trying to pin the date when I got the original Holmes Red Dragon D&D box. I thought it was 1980 for my 9th birthday, but no, it was my 8th, somewhere around my 8th birthday. My 8th birthday must have been 79. I got introduced to Dungeons and Dragons, and it was like, that was it, right? That's all I ever wanted to do. And quickly, kind of like sort of like nerdy weirdo spaz that I was, I was the one who was always harassing people to play. There's an infamous story of me harassing the girl who I had a really huge crush on, right? And our parents were friends, and we would go skiing together, and I made her sit in the back seat. This has got to be like 5th grade. Play D&D with me. I got a crush on you.
That'll show her.
Yeah, that'll learn her. But no, I just was the one who liked to, nose in books and be reading up on it and running it. And I don't know, it's part control. It's part too many ideas, too many great ideas, and a project program manager by trade, right? So there's that element of like bringing the group together that I just like. It's part of who I am. Now it's just who I am. It's part of my personality. But I'm the guy I'm the gatherer, right? Come on, everybody, we're going to play a game. Oh, Sokolowski's going to run a game. Okay. So yeah.
Were you always the GM when you were starting out?
Yeah. I've kind of always been. I'm not one of those sort of like always GMs, because I really try to push myself out of that. I had someone call me on that about 20 years ago. You always are a GM, and I was like, I firmly believe that a solid component of being a good GM, like actively being a good GM, is playing, right? Like you really need to play at least 20-25% of the time. You need to be stepping out of your comfort zone, meeting new people, trying new systems, learning new tips and tricks, and being in that more passive role where you're not directing. But yeah, I literally just got my Aliens Colonial Marines operating manual PDF in the mail like 2 hours ago, and I'm on the starting line of starting a Dungeon Crawl Classics campaign with my normal group that starts next week. Actually, we roll up characters this Sunday, and I'm like, oh, this is me, right? I was like, ooh, I texted, you guys want to play Aliens instead? They're like, no. I was like, oh, come on. Yeah. I got the manual, right? Like, so that's part of my thing is it feeds my ADD as well, right? Like I can just be like, oh, there's a new game over there. Oh.
You just run a series of one shots, like forever.
Yeah, I'm trying to balance that. That's the other thing, right? You feel like you get so wrapped up in like this mythology of running a massive campaign. I don't know if, I've got some friends who are running either Masks or, Orient Express. The Old Ways podcast, my friend does some actual play stuff, and it seems so nice, but it's so huge, right? There's something to be said for running like either one shots or sort of middle tier campaigns.
Well, it's interesting because, I think you GM differently, especially in Cthulhu, for a campaign versus a one-shot. Because if you're running Cthulhu for a one-shot, about the 6-hour mark, people start spending luck like it's going out of style. Whereas in a campaign, there's a lot more like, nope. That like players play a campaign differently versus a one-shot, and GMs GM differently, I think, as well.
Yeah, and it really gets into that slow burn style, the way to, at least, maybe not even a one-shot, but at least just like a medium tier, smaller set of sessions, even if you're playing. I ran a play test for this project that I'm working on last summer, and I think we had like 15 sessions of Call of Cthulhu. It's a modern day Call of Cthulhu campaign setting, and it was like just about 15 sessions, and that was a really great chunk because we got through, get through the first awkward 4 or 5 sessions, and the players and everyone sort of feeling themselves, feeling each other out, and then getting to the meat where you get a chance to really explore some characters and have some jokes and have some dramatic elements that can come back around. But then at the end, like by the 12th, 13th, 14th session, like traded out of PC, someone goes insane, like you get some of the real great dramatic arcs. So yeah, I need to run masks again at some point, but I'm kind of feeling like that 12 to 20 session campaign really has a lot to it,
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm trying to think. I'm on this weird quest to run like all of the great campaigns.
Oh yeah.
Sure. I don't know. I'm probably like I think I do have to give a nod to Pathfinder and run one of the Pathfinder things. But I'm ran masks, and now I'm running the Enemy Within. The new version of the Enemy Within is fantastic.
Right. That's Warhammer, right?
Yeah. And I mean that campaign is almost older than we are. And it's still like the new version is fantastic. They've done a really great job. But so I've been doing all of these big sort of epic things, and then part of me is like, I kind of just want to run like a 2-session paranoia game, just like stuff blows up and everybody's like, wahoo, like, and normally for me, cons fill that kind of niche where, in my home games and on stream, I'm running much bigger things, and at cons, that's when I can run like 8 hours of a game. And so not having had that for most of the last year and a half,
totally.
It's been, I'm feeling that itch similarly. Yeah. We're sort of dancing around here, I think, talking about pacing and how, pacing is super important. If you're in a one shot, pacing has to be, everything just is okay. Next, let's go. Whereas in a campaign, to your point, that slow build is important. Of like, you might go a couple sessions and there's no monster, there's no, the quote unquote shopping episode, that sort of thing. And so, how do you manage pacing, and like, do you have a philosophy about pacing?
Yeah. So it's certainly top of mind for me. I had, we learn from our mistakes. Speaking of aliens, I just finished running Destroyer of Worlds. I don't know if you've read or played that. It's really quite fantastic. And I'm going to run Chariot of the Gods for a second time here, actually on Thursday. Really loving the aliens role playing. Have you played aliens at all?
I've not played Aliens yet. I have the book, so I have to.
Well, maybe I need to run some of that for you.
I'm in.
Okay. Here's the thing: is when it came out on the Kickstarter, I was like, nah, and because my fear was that I was like, there's no way a role-playing game can accurately encapsulate the feeling and the mood of those movies, right? Especially the first two, right, which are really up here. I went back and watched them all, and
speaking of pacing,
right. So, and then I played in Chariot of the Gods, and I was blown away with how mechanics and game atmosphere, they just click so well. They've done such a good job of, we dropped in and it was like, I was instantly like, I'm freaking out, right? I'm already afraid of what's going to happen. But the mechanics of the panic dice and how as your stress levels go up, it gives you the ability to do more. You get more dice the more you stress out, but then your opportunity for panic and losing your mind, losing your shit. Can we swear on your podcast? I didn't.
Sure. What the heck?
Great. Goes up, right? So there's a really, really neat mechanic there. We were playing Space Marines in a session. This is probably like a month and a half ago. We had this session where the Marines were trying to get back to base, and the alien games are set up actually much like Sunspots, where you've got the framework of the sandbox, and then you've got these events that happen, and you can take the events optionally and sort of sprinkle them in. And I kept on throwing these events at the PCs. Hey, this happens. And they were just swerving around my plot points as they came to them. Like, nope. They wanted to get back to base. And I cut the session short, like not even 2 hours, because it was clear that like whatever I was playing to and they were into were not the things. Like it just kept missing, right? It wasn't a terrible time, but that game, speaking of pacing, that game, especially the cinematic scenarios, really do well riffing on a cinematic pacing. And, you know, there's definitely when, you know, we play role-playing games, especially, you know, scenarios and campaigns, right? Like it's not, there's the railroad and we try to give our players agency, right? We try to give them the capacity to make choices. And I was giving them choices and they just kept saying no and no and no and no. And I was realizing, like, you know, when we step back from our game and look at pacing, we look at how the story's working. That's just like the late second act plotting. Like just get to the action, man. Like pull out all this garbage you got. Get to the cool point. Get back to the base, because there's a lot of cool stuff that's going to happen at the base. No spoilers. Like get the team to the base. And I honestly could have almost taken those 2 hours and like put it into like 15 minutes and done a montage, right, pacing, and had them back at the base, and we would have snapped that together. And I sat back and I learned from that a lot. It made me think of, because what I don't want to do, what we don't want to do, I refrain from telling people what to do. What I try not to do in my games is decide on the pacing up front, right? That's that railroading thing where I'm going to figure out what the beats are. And that's an old bad habit of mine, where before I would say, well, I'm going to have this pacing and it's going to go, you know, whether it's sort of a cinematic pacing of, you know, dramatic tension pacing, we'll come back to this, of like positive, negative impulses, or an action movie like Aliens pacing of, you know, what's the action movie pacing? This is when I realized this. I was like, oh, talk, fight, repeat. That's it, right? Like that's all you do in an Aliens Colonial Marines game. That, you know, talk, fight, repeat. A D&D game, talk, fight, repeat, right? Like that's the pacing that you're looking for. Now you don't want to force that per se, but I'm trying not to force that. What I'm trying to do is give myself the tools in my little like mini Kanban board or whatever like set of scenes and beats that I have ready to tee up, depending on where the players go next, right?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think, you know, what you see so often is we become, you know, we want to get, you know, there's a great term in, I ran a game that was based in 70s pro wrestling, and there's a 70s pro wrestling term called, you want to get your stuff in, which is like, you know, you have these 4 moves and you're going to do them come hell or high water. You know, you're going to shoehorn them into everything. And as GMs, we want to get our stuff in. So like in your head, you're like, oh, this scene is fantastic. This is going to be a great change of pace. And you know, we as GMs can really kind of railroad stuff and try and ram things down players' throats. And they're like, whoa, no, you said get back to base. You know, why aren't we getting back to base? You know, and so, you know, there's a setting expectations kind of thing that in my opinion can be overt as well as kind of covert. You know, like I can, as the GM, say, okay, this session is going to be all about getting back, you know, about you guys getting back to base, and there's going to be complications. And now I've set the expectation to my players that getting back to base is the end, is the finish line, you know, and the stuff up to it, as opposed to if I say, when you get back to base, more stuff's going to happen. And then they're like, well, why? You know, like you were saying,
get us back to base.
You know, what is what? I don't want random monsters, you know?
I love the meta, just from a structure, right? And hopefully the table is mature enough to handle that. And that's definitely an option, deciding on what is the most important thing. I think that's what I was trying to, the 2 lessons that I learned out of that was, first was listen to the players and what are their goals? Like starting to write, I'm starting to write, like, especially in shorter scenarios, right, where there's much more action and the pacing is much more important, as opposed to, like we were talking about, the longer campaign where, you know, you can have lots of different things happening. But like putting the player goals or the PC goals, like at the top of my session notes, what are the PCs trying to do in this, in this today's session. That will guide me, because that way I'm either doing a good job of distracting them for that, or putting up true obstacles. I think that's what the problem with what I was doing was. I wasn't giving them true obstacles. I was giving them distractions, and they were like, no, we're going to be laser focused. So they were leaving stuff behind and driving around my zombies, right? And I was like, okay.
Right, and that can throw the GM off, because you've got you've got your stuff you want to get in, and every time they go around it, you're like, okay, and shuffle around some papers. Next, and so it like that energy kind of carries over, and both sides kind of we. On this podcast, we talk a lot about session 0 and about making sure that the players and the GM both want to play the same game.
Absolutely.
And that can happen on a micro and a macro scale. And in the micro scale, I think that's a good example of that, where you guys were kind of playing different games, because the players wanted to get to the base, and you were like, what about this? Hey, look at that egg, huh? And I've totally been there, and it's such a weird feeling, because you're like, oh, this is gonna be good, and they just go, and you're like, okay, what else do I got? It was
like you got your stack of 20 to 30 minute scenes, right? And they veer past all 4 of them in 15 minutes, and it's like, okay, I that's the whole session. I don't know what I'm doing.
Right. Yeah. What now? Yeah.
Well, that's our game for tonight. Thanks, guys.
Yeah. It's interesting, because con games, you don't really have that session 0, and so you have to kind of condense that whole thing down into like a 30-minute start of and really ideally, I want to learn how to do it, and kind of a rules teach in media res, so that you're using the game. One of the things I'll say for the Warhammer game, I'm surprised. I was really surprised by this. The intro module, like the starter kit, was surprisingly good at intentionally teaching the mechanics of the game. Right. So like scene 1, it's a fight. Here's how you fight, and like laying out, here's how you tell the players what they should do. And, here's how you go through the rules. And that's a session. Scene 2, it's a social scene. Here's how you do socials. It was the intentionality of it really gave me some new thoughts about structure and pacing, and trying to, especially for con games, instead of doing a didactic 30-minute this is a game, here's how you play the game, like having the game teach them that.
Oh, I love that idea. I mean, certainly there's that sort of 10-15 minutes level setting that you do at the beginning of con games, just to get everyone on the same page. Hey, who here has played this game before? Okay. You've never played the game. Have you played role-playing? Oh, you've never played role-playing games before. Okay. Right. Yeah. As opposed to sitting down with all your friends to the same session, your session 6 of a 6-session game. But I still think top of mind is, as we start session, whether it's 1 minute or 10 minutes or whatever, or a whole hour of a session 0, sitting down, every session should open with some sort of reframing. I heard the favorite podcaster talking about that idea of do you reframe at the beginning of the session? Do you reframe your players /PC's goals for them at the beginning of the session, right? And I heard some Fear of a Black Dragon. That was the podcast that I was listening to, and the idea that if it's a player-driven story, right, it's something like Power by the Apocalypse or some story games that have a lot more, put way more onus on the players to come up with this, then it's their job to sort of own their own stories. But if it's a PC-driven, sorry, not PC, GM-driven plot, investigative game, right, some sort of investigative horror, any sort of cinematic, or even a fantasy game, right, where they're being given a mission, then having the GM at the beginning, I try to reframe the goal every session. I mean, it could take 1 minute to be like, okay, you guys are down in the bunker, right, and you know that you've got 12 hours to get out of here alive, or the whole thing's going to explode. Everyone's like, right, and especially if you're not playing with if you're not playing once a week, right? Even every 2 weeks can be enough. And we've all got jobs and lives and families and just, and I don't know, a calamitous virus that's, crippled the world economy. So there's so much else top of mind. It's totally fair. And I think it's a good practice to go and resync everyone up. And then even before you do that, come in before the session. I find myself right before I start, like needing anywhere from 10 to 30 minutes, not prep time, but like, or having already prepped, but like 15 minutes to sit down and be like, okay, where am I? Like, what's my frame rate here? Where am I? What do I want to accomplish during this thing? And does it sync with, make sure what are my players going to need? What do the PCs need? And what do I need out of this? And what does the world dictate? And trying to do some just teeing up ahead of time so that you can hit the ground running, and rather than whether it's, having the players stumble around. Oh, what are we here for? I don't remember. Did you take notes? Oh no, I forgot my notes. I can't find do you have the link for that? I can't find it. I don't, my in this level, right? And
so
doing
do you have the players do a, this is a question that I'm always fascinated by.
Yeah.
Do you have the players do a recap, or do you do a recap?
It depends on my level of frustration. I'll play awkward silence if I'm feeling patient. And I'll often, depending on the game system, I'll often throw out a Benny, right? I'll be like, hey, who wants to do a recap? You would, get a reward, a free reroll, something like that, right? Like, plot point or inspiration or something like that,
good, yeah.
right? Just to get that level of engagement. But, God, players are terrible. They're just awful people. And it's just sort of like, the lieutenant's looking for someone. Hey, I need someone to go down into the tunnels. Right, and everyone's looking at their feet, right? It's like, okay, the GM's like, I need someone to do the recap for today, and everyone's like,
yeah.
Awkward silence across the board. So, it really depends on how patient I am. I have been known to sit with the awkward silence for a long time until someone, usually the same person who always does it, goes, well, fine, I'll do it. I always do it. And everyone goes, exactly.
It's funny because I do the recaps, but I forget so much that the players end up doing it.
Oh, good. I think that's a great way of doing it. Like set them up for failure, right? Be like, oh, that was the recap. And they're like, you forgot all the major plot points. You're like, go on.
Yeah. I will, I'm notorious for like, and then I think you went to the mine, and they're like, no, first we did this, and then that blew up. And, so they sort of keep me honest in that regard. But, I think the recap is actually, again, part and parcel of that pacing discussion. Because to your point, it brings everybody back to the table and sort of reframes, here's where we're going, and I love what you said about, as the GM, thinking about the player's goals and sort of keeping that in mind. I keep a little note card for every character, and I like just have sort of who they are and what they want. And I'm liking the idea of putting a goal on that card, so that I just have them here in front of me as I'm running, so I can look down really quickly and go like, oh right, he's got a brother. Well, that guy's going to show up, and now I can see, right, their goal this time is to get to the base. So I want to make that the finish line of where we're going. Yeah,
I love it. Love keeping track of that. What I've started to do at the beginning of campaigns and for myself is I've started to write my own goals for a campaign. And like, okay, I'm going to run so for instance, my latest greatest thing that I'm doing, that I'm having so much fun, I worked on it for like 4 hours today, I never get that opportunity, is I'm running a Book Hounds of San Francisco for my fellow podcasters and some folks from our Discord community. And so using Trail of Cthulhu and the Book Hounds of London, which is one of my favorite all-time books, it's really sort of a hidden gem from Ken Hite. And I dropped it into San Francisco, which we know so well, right, being from the Bay Area, loving San Francisco in 1934. And then we've just sort of been building that out. We've just got like a session and a half under our belt. We're just beginning to it. But like, I'll go myself and at the beginning of a campaign, write, well, what are my goals? Like rather than just be like, I'm going to run this campaign, that be the goal. Well, no, actually a couple of things that I'm trying to do. One is that I'm trying to run a Cthulhu game without end of the world doomsday end game, right? That they're not going to try to prevent something massively terrible from happening. Now, are there going to be bad guys? Yes, and there's going to be Cthulhu mysteries, and there's going to be murder and death and mayhem and all these things, but it's not going to be just one big end. Part of the thing also is like right out of the gate, we agreed as a group that a lot of people, this game came together really quickly. We were talking on our Discord server about a Bookhounds campaign, and I was like, I'll run it. And then suddenly I had 6 players, like within 2 hours. And I was like, okay, that's meant to be, right? Okay, that's clearly something that needs to happen. But people were like, but I don't know if I can commit. We're playing every 2 weeks. Even then, I don't know if I can commit to every session. I said, well, just do it, drop in, drop out. Not a full West marches, but the idea that you don't have to commit. Come make a character. It's based on a bookshop in San Francisco in 1934, and it's going to have all these kind of rotating casts come in and out. No pressure to you as a person to show up every session. Oh, okay, that's great. That's very helpful. Thank you. So then that made me want to change. That's a whole thing, because usually I'm like, you need to sign up. If you're going to play in my game, you need to be
project manager,
right? Right? And that was something else. That's a goal. Run a game where I can't rely, and it's not the right way to phrase it, but run a game where the players are going to be able to drop in and drop out. Okay. And then it's way more episodic, right? Way more serial to it. And that's something on me to not necessarily, I think it's really hard. I've never done it successfully. I'm not saying it can't be done. I know there are people who do it, but making those sessions where they're completely discrete, right? That you can, in fact, run a 2.5-hour session and start it and finish and be done and restart it every time. We got right into the middle of the mystery, right? And then it was okay, that was time. I ended on a cliffhanger because we're out of time. We have to pick it up. I can't just hand wave the rest of that investigation, which gets into pacing. But my point is that there, from a goals standpoint, what are my goals for running a campaign? And that, whether it's exploring a world, finding a writer or a mythology that I'm really into, all these things that give me some guidance, so that when I'm checking in with my game, I'm like, oh, and then that's that question. Are you having a good time? Right. Then you're kind of going back to your touchstones and saying, yeah, this is why I'm here. And then if you're touching on those things often, then hopefully you're engaging. You're driving delivering a good game because you're having a good time and you're finding things that are interest of you.
Yeah, we've talked a little bit about it, but you wrote a published module that I love for it's kind of system agnostic, but Sunspots. And one of the things that I love about Sunspots is that it is the epitome of a sandbox adventure.
Sure.
From design, it is, here's sort of, it's a timeline basically of an adventure. And then there are people and, here's the people and here's the places and that sort of thing. And, was that sort of, you've written a bunch of stuff. Is it more challenging to write a sandbox than it is to write kind of a dungeon crawl or whatever, a more traditional scenario? And would Sunspots look the same if you were doing it in a home game?
Yeah. So I wrote, my crazy history of running Sunspots, writing it originally, under the guidance of Keith Herber, the late great Keith Herber. I don't think I knew when I started writing it, it's coming on 10 years here, somewhere around, no, even more than that. It's got to be 2008, something like that.
I can look up the history section somewhere here.
Yeah, no, it's fine. I think I wrote it over the summer of 2008, because he died in early 2009. I was in Oregon at the time, 2007 to 2009. So I know exactly when I wrote it and when I play tested it. I don't think I wrote it. I don't think I had the inner vocabulary of I'm writing a sandbox. I think that the conversations were about writing something larger in scope, writing the big driving element was, picking these great old ones, picking this specifically, spoiler spoilers, I guess. Azeroth, maybe. Azeroth, and taking a new. It was all about a new take on Azeroth, right? And so that's where we came up with some of the plot devices and the artifacts around that, and that just spun out into create this creative writing process of like, hey, here's this town, and there's this malevolent force, sort of, and ooh, wouldn't it be interesting if, and that sort of like the main twist of it came into play, and then I just wrote to that, and I've certainly, from a writing standpoint, I write too much. I talk too much. I write too much, right? Like I write it all. Blah, 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 blah. Yeah, I'm definitely, a good editor is, for me is necessary. So, but I didn't have the inner vocabulary of I'm going to write a sandbox game, right? But it wasn't until well into it and play testing and having kind of, a sandbox game. That's what this is, right? The idea that you can show up and there's momentum, right? There's happening, like you said, there's stuff happening in the background, but you can kind of go out of the gate like one of 12 different places, right? And you can draw your own line. And I've listened to a number of playthroughs. Yours is, I'm just starting on yours, but I've listened to a number of playthroughs, and it boggles my mind. I'm like, how did they end up there? I've never heard of that before. But everyone's different, right? And that's what's really great.
We mangled it. I'll tell you, we mangled it.
It's okay. That's fine. But so if I wrote it now, it definitely would start. I would definitely write it as a sandbox. And like we were talking ahead of the show, like, I don't know, there's a little bit of magic in a bottle sort of thing with that, where like that ignorance, like I didn't know I was writing a sandbox, and I didn't really know what I was putting to it. Like I've tried to carve it out a couple times after it's all been done. What the hell are you up to, man? Like, I'm just looking back at myself from 12 years ago, being like, I don't know. Clearly,
I'll tell you, the one device that I am 100% stealing and using again is that, the upfront investigation aspect of that is all flashback.
Oh, yeah.
And I think that's a really interesting way to handle the, pacing again. Okay, let's go search this room for 4 hours, and that's like, that starts the game. And it's like, no, this is, it's kind of in a way almost Trail of Cthulhu-ish, where it's like, ding, you found all the clues, move on,
Yeah, I like that. I mean, that gets back to your point about hard framing, right? Of saying up front, I'm going to, the first few scenes of this, scenes of this, I'm going to just kind of tell you what's going on. There's definitely if I rewrote it, I would probably make it longer. I would probably put more in. But what would be fun, what my idea was, and the reason I hard framed the flashbacks to move pacing along, like you said, is that that initial investigations in Evergreen College, it's just it's a little bit railroady, right? You've got these there's 3 sets of clues. There's 4 scenes before you get to the main device. There's 4 scenes, and if you let your players, this is that interesting thing. Like if you just give them to your players organically, it definitely feels railroady because you're just going 1, 2, 3, 4. There's nothing else. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. There's no agency along that anyway. And there's a sort of like in media res, sort of like just throwing your players off the deep end. Car crash. Wait a second. Where are we? How the hell did we get here? Great question. Let's talk about the last 12 hours, right? And then you can move through them and hard frame them that way. I would, if I went back and remixed it, like it would be neat to, you could sandbox the town of Evergreen a little bit. Like, wouldn't it be kind of cool if there was something else there? Realizing that as written, there is nothing there. But yeah, I think that's why it has to work like that. That there's definitely an element, and you can move pacing wise. You can get through those 4 beats in an hour, right? You can move. You can cook your game along and get everyone within 10 to 15 minutes through each set of clues, and then as opposed to, like you said, like then well, wait a second. I want to do this. I want to do this. I want to do this, right? And
I go to the newspaper.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
All the Call of Cthulhu tropes.
Yeah.
The so in our version, a few things that went, and this will be some spoilers for Sunspots. So you know, if you're
spoiler away.
But we're GMs. What and trust me, if you run Sunspots, your game is going to be 100% different. No, I don't think any GM has ever played a module straight out of a book before. We
you're right. The Wild West thing, that's neat. Yeah. Like I told some people about that, and they were like, "Oh, that's a really good idea."
It worked out really well. The few times that it was sort of anachronistic, we're not that bad, and it really added, like, it made the John Yellowbird character, the Native American character, an even more interesting character. Sure. Yeah, having that facade on it. So my players were from the beginning suspicious of the big bad guy, and so about the second episode, I decided the big bad guy was actually the hero. And he was going to try and destroy the MacGuffin of this thing. Okay. And there was a character you created that was a translator, and she was translating the big bad guy kind of doesn't know anything. He's just getting everything from her. And so I was immediately like, oh my gosh, she is, she's just feeding him bad information, and she's going to get all the benefit of this. And, my players didn't even suspect her until the end. And so it was a nice way to sort of add a twist there, as they were all staring at Partridge going like, all right, I'm ready in action to shoot him when his sudden and inevitable betrayal occurs.
Well, she's my favorite character. So go ahead.
No, please.
So she's not only my favorite NPC of the story, but I've had people be like, oh, they ended up rescuing her and leaving everyone else behind, and the whole place was destroyed because they loved her too much. And it was like, it's one of those, we can only be so lucky that we can truly create a character that we can truly fall in love with. Right? We have so many fictional characters that we actually fall in love with, that if we create a non-player character that, I don't know, Princess Leia, right? Like, I'm totally in love with Princess Leia, and through Carrie Fisher's lens, right? Or, whoever our characters are, Henry Armitage, right? Like, there's a cool kind of a cool character, right? It's got some mythology about it.
Elias Jackson.
Jackson
Elias. Whoops, Jackson
Elias, right? Jackson Elias.
In our game, we have an Elias Jackson. That's why I said
Elias, Jackson. Yeah, absolutely, right? So if Rebecca Newman, if you create these tensions and you create these personalities, if she seems to have taken on a life of her own, I'm very proud of her as a character, and I'm so glad people are always coming up with new ways to do cool things with her. And she clearly has some inner motivation, right? Because people are able to make her the big bad. That's great. Love it.
Yeah. Well, and the other interesting thing, so you don't expressly say this, but as I sort of read, one of the chief ideas of the game is an almost kind of Terry Pratchett concept of, as these people become gods and have more believers, they have more power. So I actually downplayed the stones, and I kind of upplayed almost like a social media, like I have more followers than you, so I'm more powerful than you. And there was this like blob tag game of like weaker gods being subsumed by and my players totally got into that. Partly because they don't believe in anything, and so they tried to help John Yellowbird, and he got no power from them because they don't, they were all these amoral,
right, atheists or whatever. Yeah, right. Yeah, love it. Absolutely.
The neat thing about, it's I think everybody in the back of their mind is like, I would love to be a published scenario writer, but it's a different kind of writing. It is totally different than just creating, your scenario for your home game, because you have to, I'm not going to pretend like I know. I'm going to ask you, like, what were some of those differences, and like, how do you approach it differently?
Yeah, I will be super transparent and real in this moment, and say that I don't think I'm a great scenario writer. I think at my best I can be pretty good. I think Sunspots, like we talked about, is a lightning in a bottle sort of moment. It helps. I still have my email from Keith Herber, right, where we're talking and he's giving me notes. on that, having a good editor, someone to guide you with that. I think my biggest challenge that I had to get through, and I finally did probably 5 or 6 years ago, was realizing, because I always want to be a fiction writer first. I'm really an essayist. I have a degree in journalism. So like, it's sort of like the narrative first, and then I get in love with my characters and my story. And that's sort of like the thing that I've been in. And then it took me up until, like I said, like 5 years ago, where I realized, oh, just to your point, like writing a story is different than writing a role-playing game, however that is, whether it's a system or a scenario or a campaign or even just a set of ideas. And they're different. And I think that, getting back to pacing, getting back to characters, I think one of the main things with writing a scenario, and if you're thinking about through line of publishing, these days it's never been easier, whether you're on the self-publishing route, like sort of like one-man shop like myself with Weird 8, or you can go to the Miskatonic repository. My friend and co-podcaster Bridget Jeffries is just named a community ambassador for the Miskatonic repository. You can go and with very little structure, go and put your Call of Cthulhu scenario, put it together and get it out there. But you want it to be good. And I think that the key element that I'm always trying to drive to myself, because I am still writing for publication and I'm still writing for other GMs to run my things, is you're not writing the story. It's about writing characters and impulses and their plans, right? That's what you're writing, and the characters will create their own through line through your sort of like milestones or whatever it is. But it's not your story to write. It's you're building a platform for a group of people to scaffolding for them to build the story, their own story within, right? So you're building the outline, you're the setting and the time and the things that are happening and the impulses and some of the backstory. Extraneous backstory is kind of out. That's why another reason why I think Sunspots is a little bit, like a little bit outdated now. Like there's a huge backstory to that, right? And I think about all of the stuff that goes into that around the different sun gods and the history of the sunstones, and like, oh my God, dude, like just relax. Right? Like there's just so much, but it it serves its purpose. But that's all scaffolding, and the town is scaffolding, and the NPCs and their impulses are scaffolding for the characters to come in. And I think that that's the most important thing to keep in mind. It's not, as a writer, it's not your story. It's not, when I'm writing a new scenario, it's not my story to tell. I'm putting plans into motion, and then the players are going to, speedboat over the whole thing, sort of.
Yeah, and I thought, one interesting aspect, you leave the ending very open-ended, which, which a lot of written scenarios don't necessarily do. Nowadays, I think it's more prevalent to have that happen. But, sort of having, you have a couple of like, what if they do this? What if they, and that sort of thing. But in general, the ending is very much like, where are they going?
Yeah, and I think that that's, again, really, really key, is to giving, you can't, as a writer, you can't create all the threads, right? It's really about creating, I think that some of the keys to writing a successful scenario, and again, like I don't have this locked down, but like you've got the major beats, the major places that the story is going to go, and then there are like supporting ideas. I wrote a 2-page scenario for Dissident Whispers, which came out last summer in the wake of the BLM protests. It's a great book. You can get the PDF on Drive through Dissident Whispers. It's got a whole bunch of 2-page scenarios. It's got Mothership. I just got a bunch of system agnostics or D&D stuff. There's a Cthulhu. My friend wrote a mythos thing in there. But the whole OSR thing is all about these little random tables, right? Whether you're playing Mothership or Troika or it's just something D&D like, the idea of these little random tables of fulfilling your filling your little dungeon or your little experience with who knows what's going to happen. I'm going to roll. Oh, it's a surprise for everybody.
Right.
And I think that being able to write toward that is really important. The surprise, right? My favorite, we were just talking about this the other day with a podcast of like my favorite moments are when my job is as a GM is to throw out a problem, and my players' PCs come in and solve it. And my love is when they come up with something absolutely crazy that I had no idea that they were going to do. Right? Just like surprise. Oh, okay. I didn't know we were going to do that today. Right? Okay, here we go.
I think that's 100% true. I have sort of moved away. One of the things I really don't like in games is puzzle games where, there's a riddle or something like that, because there's a whole player knowledge versus character knowledge and all this stuff. And so, I played a game, I don't even remember, at some con where after the game, I went to the GM and I'm like, I've never played such an organic puzzle before. Like, how did you sort of have the solution that we could get to that easily? And the guy goes, oh, the answer was whatever you came up with. That was the answer to the puzzle. And I have 100% stolen that. That's all I do for puzzles now. Like I ran a game based in San Francisco, Chinatown, and I had a map. And it was a map from 1900 of Chinatown, and there were all these different buildings. And I made this ridiculous like verse that could have alluded to like 8 different spots on the map. And just whichever one they pick is the right one. But you still get that feeling of the players of being like, okay, let's triangulate and let's figure this out. It's got to be there. And you're like, it sure is.
Yeah, and that gets back to that idea of like it's as the writer, as the creator, designer, it's not our duty to figure out how things are going to go, right? It's just a framework. It's just a setting and some impulses to allow the table, and we get to create, right? Because we get to give the NPCs, we get to give life to the NPCs and the bad guys and all the stuff. But really, the best moments are that it's the surprise for everyone, right? And I think just going back to the pacing idea of, if we think about like narrative dramatic pacing in movies, right? That's kind of the touchstone that I'm using these days. There's about payoff. Right. And it has a story giving, is the ending, have you earned your payoff? Right. And I think that's finding that organically without forcing it is really like those true moments, right? Whether it's, something like Sunspots or whether it's an Aliens game or whatever it is, right? The Aliens games are really structured in their plot. They're super structured, but they try to at least give the players some room to explore within a ship or within a base or something like that. Is the payoff, have they earned it, right? Both the GM, by giving you like that, again, that pacing thing got in the way. The next session we snapped and we were at the fort and we had 2.5 sessions, right? And that last session, I just put the hammer down on the accelerator. It was like boom, 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 boom. And then spoiler, they blew up the base, right? And I was surprised. I wasn't sure whether they were going to escape or they were just going to blow it up. And they were like, oh, and then we're just going to go blow the whole thing. Oh, okay. And they earned it, right? And it was the payoff for like a good 22 hours of game session, right? Very well. And you just don't know how this stuff is going to play off. And I think that goes back to the pacing, right? Of like leaving the ending, designing to an ending that has a few different possibilities, but that thematically ties back so that all the choices, this is a good book, this is a good movie, this is a good TV show, all of the choices seem to, in retrospect, lead up to that ending, right?
Yeah,
and that's, yeah. So,
the challenge is figuring out, like, when is it one too many? Because you want to just keep adding fuel to the fire and keep, here's an, oh, that was one too many, and how do you sort of, because I often run into that where I'm like, oh man, if I just put one more thing on here, it's going to be awesome.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, now I'm gilding the lily. That was one too many. I mean, we've weaved a lot of stuff in here, and you've been very generous with your time. So, I mean, you run. We said earlier, no GM runs just one system, but like you run, I find, an incredible diversity of systems. You're like, do you run the same game twice? I don't.
That's a good question. I mean, yeah, like I'm gonna run Aliens, the Chariot of the Gods. I may run it for you, right? Like, so I'm going to run for my second time starting on Thursday. I am definitely like, as far as a gamer goes, right? Like, you know, people who are like, this is my little gaming box and this is all I do. Like, I'm all over the place. I got war games, I got board games, I got card games, I got role-playing games, I got all the role-playing games. Yeah, I'm definitely like all, you know, the next shiny thing, whatever it is. And you know, it's so easy these days to have it all. I'm looking at my board. I did such a huge paring down of my board game collection, and it's like I still have so many great games. Can't do it all. But I like Bookhounds. I ran a short Bookhounds campaign 10 years ago, like 5 sessions, something like that, and it was one of my most favorite campaigns of all time. Like, I'm definitely going back to, I've played a lot of Trail of Cthulhu. To answer your question, do I play the same thing? Sometimes. I don't know. I definitely have favorites. You know, I'm playing Dungeon Crawl Classics. I love Dungeon Crawl Classics. Probably out of all the fantasy role-playing games, it's probably my favorite. Play that one from a system standpoint. Like, I could open the book now and be like, oh yeah, here's this page. I think Aliens I've played through a couple scenarios now. Call of Cthulhu 7th Ed, I think they really did a great job of that. But now I'm playing Trail of Cthulhu and going back into that and feeling I'm designing this scenario and getting back into the groove of, oh yeah, you know, there's some elegance to Trail. I know that some people.
One of my favorite things in Trail is the stability versus sanity, especially as, you know, I think for me personally, the sanity mechanic has always been a little tone deaf. Well, not always. You know, it's only in sort of as I've matured and kind of changed how I approach things. You know, like, I've really pared back the sanity mechanics, and, you know, I really focus it on fight, flight, or freeze, and sort of how you react in the moment, not just let's roll on a random table and see what wacky problem you've got now. You know, totally. But I really like the Trail of Cthulhu stability versus sanity and that kind of dichotomy. And I've been fooling around with ways to integrate that into my Cthulhu campaign.
Yeah, I do agree that there's something to be said for a day-to-day mental health, that's your stability, versus, you know, a perception of the universe that, for the most part, as you go through your investigative horror game, never comes back, right? This idea of this creeping doom and this shrinking, draining perspective, right? I love the idea that you can have something like, all, you know, men are inherently good, and, you know, or, you know, Christianity is the center of the universe. You can create these pillars of sanity, and that they get chopped down, and how that can completely flatten a section of your personality is not the right thing, but just your willpower and how you perceive the universe. I absolutely agree. It has way more nuance to it.
Yeah, it's. I think it's a really interesting session. I also really like. I haven't finished the book yet, but I got Tiny Cthulhu, which is a really interesting. It's a 2d6 system. It's super. You know, it's, you know, I love things where the rules get out of the way and let's get right into it. And it's got some interesting, sort of much lighter touch sanity mechanics that are.
I like. We just interviewed. By the time that you put this up, ours will probably be out. We just interviewed Paul Baldowski, who did the Cthulhu hack and the Desanction. And the Cthulhu hack has some really interesting. The way that it treats the sanity is that as you have, and I don't know if sanity is even what the word it uses for it, but it's sanity mechanic is, you know, it's got that sort of resource die where you start with a D12, right? And if you roll, whenever you roll it, and if you roll a 1 or a 2, you drop down to the next D. So you go D12, D10, D8, D6, D4, right? And so every time you roll a 1 or a 2, you drop down in die set, right? So you're losing your capacities for holding on. I thought that's
really cool.
Yeah, I would encourage looking at the Cthulhu hack. It's got it uses the same thing for, it's got investigations. Let's see, what is it called? Cigarettes and the flashlights are these 2 resources that you can use. You don't have skills. You have cigarettes and flashlights, where those are your resources to either grease human, right, to interact with people, or you're sneaking around and looking for something, and that's the resource that you use to grease the wheels of the investigation and find your clues, right? Again, boiling it down to a couple of really clever mechanics. I would look at the Cthulhu hack. It was on sale on drive-thru.
Well, you've alluded to it a few times, but let's just talk briefly. The Miskatonic University podcast is a great resource for Cthulhu GMs. Not only because you are talking to sort of anybody who's anybody in the mythos world, and not just in the Call of Cthulhu frame of that, but to your point, people who are sort of bringing in other systems and that sort of thing. Yeah. But also, you guys talk a lot of GMing on that podcast.
Yeah, we're all GMs, and people seem to respond. I mean, this sort of conversation is great, right? This thing you're having with it. I think we all, as GMs, are always trying to look for the next hook, the next trick, right? The next tips and tricks, right? And it's not something, I mean, you go look at YouTube, right? There's just a gazillion things about how to be a best dungeon master. But investigative horror, in whatever it is, because Aliens is a little bit investigative horror. We got Call of Cthulhu and Trail of Cthulhu and some of the other systems, even like the Desanction that my co-host is running. All of these systems have the same sensibilities. We were just talking about it last night. We have a running hypothesis that investigative horror players, Call of Cthulhu players, make the best role players. And I'm just going to throw shade on everybody else who's not. So I'm just going to presume that that's our wheelhouse here.
And then the LARPers marched.
Right, exactly. But the idea that you might have someone who is more into D&D or more into a generic fantasy role playing comes to the table wanting something out of their situation, and someone who's an investigative horror player or GM comes to the table wanting something else, right? And better, worse, whatever. I don't mean to be so judgmental, but I think we're more attached to what makes a good investigative horror game, right? And we talk a lot about that because that's sort of front of mind for us, and it's a little bit different than all the other fantasy role-playing game podcasts that are out there. So yeah, it's one of our favorite topics for sure.
I mean, I would narrow that down to, I would say that story games, and Call of Cthulhu is kind of a story game, not really, but kind of.
Almost there, yeah. It's a hybrid.
Is the game more about the or do you think more, or is your focus your character or the story? And in D&D, I would say the focus is almost always your character.
Yeah.
And in games like Call of Cthulhu or story games, that sort of thing, the focus is more the story. And your character is a vehicle to drive the story, as opposed to the story being a vehicle to drive your character. And, it's totally. that sense of, I love the almost improv games where you're just, I can give your character characteristics, and that just doesn't happen in D&D. Your character is inviolate, and and this is my sheet, and that sort of thing. It's that mindset to me is fascinating. I'm always sort of challenging it backward. So what is your favorite system to run? We're going to run through the lightning round here.
Okay, favorite system to run. I'd say right now it's Alien. It's so good. We're having a lot of fun with it, and it's with the panic dice, and the tension's really good. And I've just finally played enough of it. I've probably got about 20 sessions underneath my belt, so I can run it. So Call of Cthulhu's from an all-time Call of Cthulhu. I could run Call of Cthulhu in my sleep, but yeah.
And what's the system you haven't run that you really want to?
Yeah, great question. That I haven't run. You know what it is I haven't run Dread. I haven't even played Dread.
Dread is a hard one to run.
Yeah.
I want to talk about pacing.
Yeah, exactly.
One of the real challenges of Dread is like the tower falls down. What do you do now? Is it how do you get that back? Dread is a really. I have not run Dread. I've played it several times, and every time I've played it, I'd be like, "Ooh, I really want to run this," and then I think about it, and I'm like, I have no idea how.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's like a con challenge. I'm just gonna like one day I'm gonna run a Dread game. I think it would have to be a short game.
Well, I haven't. I think I just need to play it. It's one of those games where I just haven't. I just need to play it so that I can wrap my mind around and be in the moment, right? And have that. It's definitely been out there. I had them. I don't even know if I have it anymore. I had the book for a while. It just never happened. So you and I need to play Dread together.
I mean, honestly, the rules of Dread, once you get past the sheet, the tower, the rules are almost unimportant. It's sort of all figuring out how you're going to manage the tower and how you're going to when to tell people what to pull. That's a real challenge. Our buddy Dwayne, he runs actually a paranoia Dread game.
Oh.
Where the tower has different colors, and it's much easier to pull that green brick, but it's not your security clearance.
Yeah.
I love that idea.
Yeah, I love it.
What is your number one tip for new GMs?
For new GMs, it's not your story; it's the group story. So don't get married to whatever great idea you have. Tee up a framework and not a story. That's it. Come to the table with questions and ideas that you want your players' PCs to challenges for them to overtake. Right.
I love that idea of asking players questions. Especially in like an investigative horror setting. Like, what does that mean to you? That just asking questions like that can really make a player think about something in a way they maybe haven't thought about it.
Yeah.
Like in the end of Sunspots, one of my players tried to sacrifice themselves and was unsuccessful. And so I didn't ask this on stream, but I just, I sent her a message after it. I'm like, what do you think that does to Jonesy that you tried to kill yourself and it didn't work? What does that do to your head? I think that's a fascinating question. All right. So time to spring it on you. The end of every episode, we end the same way. The Space Jam question. Aliens have invaded the Earth. They will destroy our planet unless you run a 4-hour game that they love. What, Dave Sokolowski, are you running?
4-hour game that the aliens love. Let's see here. Or else they destroy the world. A 4-hour game.
Aliens would be an ironic answer.
I know. It feels right, but I don't know if you can nail the pacing.
4 hours is the trick, yeah.
4 hours is the trick, right? I would probably run something. I would probably run a Call of Cthulhu game, something really, really simple and straightforward, like The Haunting or something like that, right? Like something it's not the cheap seats, but it's a little bit tried and true, and
teach those aliens to hate that bed.
The bed's good. And I would even start them. In 4 hours. If I only had 4 hours, I would start them at the front door. And just be like, and here's your handful of clues. Here's what you know up to this thing, and go right. Oh, okay, right, and have them jump right in. So The Haunting for the win, I think. Right?
I think that's a great answer. I actually have run The Haunting in systems other than Call of Cthulhu, but I ran The Haunting in Paranoia once.
Nice.
That was a very different. But I think The Haunting is an all-time scenario. I think it's great.
Yeah, the only other one that right now you mention it is for different systems. I'll just mention it because it's also a classic if you haven't played it or run it. Last Things Last, which is a Delta Green scenario. I ran it last year. We kind of had a Dark Ages game that didn't really go anywhere. But anyway, I ran it in like 2.5 hours. Last Things Last in a Cthulhu Dark Ages game. And it sang. So it worked so well. 2 players, and it was one of those things where we all walked away and was like, "Well, that was awesome." And I literally just made it up, right? I know the story well enough, right? It's a Last Things Last is another classic. That might,
Man, you've just made me think that like I should add a question to my end of show questions, and that is, what's your favorite scenario? You know, because I think that's such a cool. Because one of my keys to GMing is just read stuff.
Yeah.
Read. I went through probably my late teens to my 30s. I didn't play a role-playing game, but I still read stuff. I'd pick up modules and I'd read through them, and you see how the people who write scenarios approach various things and how they, how to structure a scenario, how to structure an encounter, that sort of thing. And just reading everything you can.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I think it's a great idea. What's your favorite scenario, all-time scenario? Because there's some good ones out there. There's some ones that really, really do well. So.
Yeah, because as I'm thinking about it, have you ever played Rough Night at the Three Feathers?
I have not.
So Rough Night at the Three Feathers, I wonder if it's the first sandbox module ever, sandbox scenario ever. It's from the early 80s. It's for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, but you can play it in anything. And it is literally a timeline. The entire module is there's I think 5 storylines, and I know you have to go cook dinner, so we'll be.
No, finish your thought.
But there are 5 storylines that run through the night, and the entire module is one night in an inn, and it goes at 11:30. This happens at midnight. This happens, and you just as a GM, it's just okay if the players aren't doing anything. 11:30, you hear a crash downstairs.
Right.
It's this, as a GM, it's what I love. It's plate spinning, because the players are going to throw everything off kilter. And so you're like, what are the cultists going to do when the players are in the common room at midnight, and it's just, I love it. I love it. I could run it every day. It's so much fun. Well, thanks. Dave, thank you so much. You can see it on the screen there, but you can listen to Dave and friends on the Miskatonic University podcast. It is a great listen. And you can see he publishes stuff all over the place. He pops up in all sorts of. What's the next thing you have coming out?
Apocathulu.
That you can talk about.
Yeah, Apocathulu, Cthulhu Reborn, Dean Englehart and Joe Creel. The Apocathulu, the first Apocathulu book is already out. It's really fantastic. I have a scenario / world in the second one, which I think is going to be out. It might be out by the end of this year. So that's the next thing that's been done for a little while. That's coming out.
I've never heard of Apocathulu. I
should run Apocathulu. We have a lot of games to play.
I know.
We need to play more games together. So let's do that.
There you go. That is the takeaway from this. All right. Well, thank you so much. And folks, thank you for listening and watching. We will have another conversation in 2 weeks with another great GM. And until then, keep the game moving.
Thanks.